So to get started, so this is a slide showing you our study site and not exactly where you expect to find a forest. So we're 10 miles offshore of Gulf Shores, Alabama, and the forest is actually located in 60 foot of water. So I'm going to take you scuba diving, and just to orient you to what you're going to see underwater. So I put a picture up here of one of our beautiful bald cypress trees. So the trees with the leaves are no longer standing. What we have underwater is there's stumps and there's branches and things that you would see on the bottom of a bald cypress forest. So if you imagine taking a bald cypress tree, cutting it off down towards the base, you'll see something like this. It's a very distinctive shape. You've probably seen tables around the area made out of bald cypress. And this is what we're going to see underwater. So Allison, you want to start the video? So this is some of our raw footage diving the forest. Now, this particular site, we're close to the Mobile River, so the visibility is not always excellent. So that's what we're seeing. Oh, thank you. But as you look at it, you'll notice there's lots of fish swimming around. These fish are very familiar to me because these are fish that we see on coral reefs. And it's kind of interesting that they're this far north, up in the northern part of the continental shelf on the just south of Alabama. Now, one of the reasons why there's so many fish out here is because normally it's just a flat sand sheet out there. But because there's a depression and it's eroding back and this wood is exposed, it gives the fish a place to hide. And that's how this spot was initially found, was a fisherman was driving around and his fish finder started to go off. And he's like, wait a minute, there's a lot of fish here. So he started fishing the spot. Eventually, divers went down to see why there were so many fish, came back and reported that there was all of these tree stumps on the bottom. Now, as we go through the video, what we're seeing right here, this is wood, and there you can see some of the branches coming out of the sediment ledge. A lot of them now are encrusted with sea anemones, so they're starting to erode now that they're exposed to the marine environment. And diving is kind of special because we see all kinds of interesting critters in there. So at one point in the video, you'll see a little arrow crab come out and pose for the camera. So we also have a turtle that lives on the site. So when we go out there to do our work, whenever I see the turtle pop up, I know we're at the forest. So it's a really interesting place to scuba dive and to see what's happened on the sea floor that it's exposed these trees so that we can study them. And there's the arrow crab. All right. So this is just one of the stills from one of our videos. And me and one of my former graduate students diving. And then to our right, you can see that outline of the bald cypress stump. Does everybody see that? Sort of. Yeah, it's the clarity is not its best, but there is a stump. Let me see if I can point it out. So that's the stump right there. Does everybody see it now? Okay. So when we started working on this site, we knew there was trees down there, but people who do tree ring studies, they work on land. Not a lot of them scuba dive. So it's one of the reasons why I'm working on this project is I'm a scuba diver. I work on coral reefs. So I'm one of the few people who has taken down an increment borer and cored a tree underwater. So that particular sample that I pulled out of the stump, we did radiocarbon date that, and it came back radiocarbon dead. Unfortunately, my increment borer, I did not get it all back. It got sacrificed to the Gulf of Mexico. So it's not something I recommend doing. So just to orient you on a map, so here we're looking at our study site, and that is the red box with the arrow next to it. So we're just south of Gulf Shores. Now this particular site is really close to where Hurricane Ivan tracked across the Gulf of Mexico before it made landfall in Alabama. So if you remember back to Hurricane Ivan, This was a very strong hurricane. At one point, it was a Category 5. It dropped down to a Category 4 in the Gulf of Mexico, finally making landfall as a Category 3. Some of the largest recorded wave heights were produced by Hurricane Ivan, so 90-foot waves. So the other thing that scientists have noticed from Ivan is it also created quite a bit of scour on the sea bottom, where we had different moorings that have been scoured out from the bottom. So we think Hurricane Ivan is the storm that exposed the underwater forest. Now, the other question you might have is, okay, we've got stumps. They're in growth position out in the Gulf of Mexico. How did they get there? They were not moved there. A river did not transport them there. That is where they grew. That is where they lived. So how do you get trees that far offshore? To do that, you have to change sea level. And we can do that by going back into the ice ages. So this particular diagram is showing you the last glacial maximum that occurred 18,000 years ago. And this is when sea level is going to drop to its lowest extent during that last ice age. And the red box is our study site, and I put a gold star as close as I could to LSU, just to orient you where we're located. And then, of course, Florida's over here, and you'll notice Florida is about twice as wide during the last glacial maximum than it is today. So there's definitely space as sea level drops to have a forest that's growing in what's now the marine environment. So go ahead and start this video. So just to walk you through what happens during an ice age, we're going to go back 125,000 years ago to the last interglacial. This is the last time the Earth was as warm as it is today. Sea level was actually 6 meters higher than it is today. And what we're going to do as this goes through this animation, the top here tells you time. I've got a graph here with time and relative sea level. So as we go forward in time, you're going to see sea level drops. And as sea level drops, you'll notice on land this large ice sheet. It's growing, it's expanding, and it shrinks back, and then it grows again, gets taller, and becomes larger. And so all of this is happening during our glacial interval. So we're getting to 36,000 years ago. We're going to start getting into the last glacial maximum about 18,000 years ago. This is when that ice sheet is going to become its largest. And then it's eventually going to go through this 10,000 years of melting till we get to modern conditions today. So you can see through the ice age, we have quite a bit of change happening along our coastlines as this ice sheet gets bigger and smaller. So now to take you into what we've been doing with our research. So first thing we did is, or I did, is I started calling people that I knew who were experts in their field to come out and do research with me. So I talked with Sam Bentley, who's here tonight, and Kevin Hsu over in oceanography, some of my colleagues over at Southern Mississippi who do tree ring work and pollen work, and let's go out and do some research. So this is a photo from one of our research cruises where we went out and we did geophysical surveys and we took sediment cores. Oops. So this is the bottom of one of the longest cores that we collected. It's almost 5 meters long. And again, when you're working out in the Gulf of Mexico, you don't expect to pull up a core that has organic muds in the bottom. And if you look closely, you can see little roots, pieces of leaf, and a piece of wood. So we definitely have something that looks like peat sediments you would find on land today, but these are offshore. So it's out in the Gulf of Mexico. So we got some really exciting core that we brought back to LSU to do work on. So the other thing we wanted to figure out was how old is the forest? So by just going by water depth and the global sea level curves, when I first started working on this, I thought the forest age would be about 10,000 to 12,000 years. And I got some wood samples that we collected diving, and I sent them off to get radiocarbon dated, and my colleague talked to me about it, and he said, they're radiocarbon dead. And I'm like, what do you mean? He goes, they're too old, I can't date them. And I was like, okay. So we got our sediment cores, So this is the bottom meter and a half of that largest core. So up at the top here, we have lots of sand. There's an unconformity or erosional surface in here, this sand section. And then we get into the organics, the peat with the wood here at the bottom. So we pulled lots of samples, sent those off to get radiocarbon dated. And we got 2 dates that came back. So again, we're really close to the limits of what radiocarbon can do, but these are good dates. So we're in that 41,000 to 45,000 years. But the other 17 samples that we sent from that core that I cored underwater and other wood samples and from our sediment cores, they all came back radiocarbon dead. So we looked at doing a different type of sampling method, and that is OSL, or optically stimulated luminescence. This is a dating method where we look at the sand and the sediments and we see how long it's been buried. So we looked at those sediments right above that organic layer, and we started to get dates back from all of our different cores in the range of 74 to 56,000 years. So we know we're in the early part of that ice age. So just to throw up our sea level curve again. So our dates from OSL are here in red, and then our 2 radiocarbon dates here. So you can see we're in the ice age. The ice sheet's not at its largest extent yet, but sea level has definitely dropped enough that we can have that space for the forest to grow. So the forest was a lot older than we expected. So this is a figure just showing you what the site looks like. So this is from our geophysical data. So this is the vertical scale has been exaggerated. It definitely, if you're diving out there, the little part here where the hole is, where that star is, that's the location of one particular stump that's about 5 foot across. So that little ledge that I was down in scuba diving, it's only a couple of feet. It's not very deep. And then we have this sand hill over here to the east. So there's not a lot of relief in the area, but there is where you can see changes across the area. And once we got the geophysical data, we started to look at our sediment cores and start to piece together the story of what this site looked like when the trees were alive. So this is some digital elevation models that our students put together. And so it's the same as what we were looking at here. We've just rotated, and now we're looking through the sediments. So the top here, that's that sand hill. Here's the depression over here to your left. And right below that is the transgressive surface. So that's where we're having erosion that happens. So above that surface is Holocene, it's modern times. Below that is the Ice Age. And then we have this bottom surface that we could also render from the geophysical data. So that should be that last interglacial surface. So what we see looking at this cross section, and we've added in the data from one of the cores, is we just started to get into that peat section in our sediment cores. So one of the things we want to do with our next phase of the project is go back out, do some deeper cores, see if we can get through that whole interglacial interval. So now let's look at some other work we've done. So this is the tree ring work that my colleague Grant Harley has been working on. And Grant is a tree ring guy, and what he did was took the wood that I collected diving. So I brought back 23 pieces of wood. And what he does is he looks at cross sections where you can see the rings in the tree. And trees, if they're happy, they have good growing conditions, they'll put on a wide ring. If they're stressed, they put on a smaller ring. And every year you get this sequence of wider or smaller rings. And dendrochronologists can match up those patterns. It's something called cross-dating. And they can align different trees from across an area and build long chronologies of how climate was changing in a particular area. So that's what we're going to do with these tree ring records. So this is the master chronology we were able to put together. We were actually able to cross-date 10 of these pieces of wood. The longest one is almost 500 years long. Some other ones were shorter. So as you start to look at this data, it's floating because we don't have an exact age, but the young or the oldest part of the tree is here to the left, and then the bark is over here to the right. So as we go through, we'll see that it kind of bounces around. So that tells you some years are warm, some years it's cold, good growing conditions versus bad growing conditions. But what's interesting, as we get to the last 150 years, we start to get into this interval of reduced growth. So the trees are not experiencing optimal growing conditions. Then we get a large stress event. Something happens that causes all the trees to reduce their growth. And right after this stress event, we get recovery. And this is typical when a forest goes through a stress event. A lot of trees die, the canopy opens up, the trees that survive, they start to grow to fill up the canopy. So after recovery, we get this another stress event, and all 10 of these trees die at the same time. And we know that they died at the same time because our pieces of wood still have the bark on them. So we were really surprised to get this result. This is a paper we currently have in review. Now, another thing we did, looking at these tree ring chronologies, is we wanted to know, was this forest very close to what we have with modern environmental conditions, or was it different? So what this analysis does is it takes bald cypress chronologies from all over the southeast and compares them to our site from the Ice Age. So when you see these red colors, like up here in the upper Mississippi Valley in Tennessee and Arkansas, and then over here in South Carolina, North Carolina, these patterns of growth match our Ice Age forests very closely. So this tells us the growing conditions when these trees were alive were very similar to the conditions you would experience a lot further north than today. So up in Arkansas, Tennessee, and the Carolinas. So that would be, those forests would be what that forest looked like when it was alive. Other things we found in the sediment cores we were surprised is we have well-preserved seeds. So this is a project that's ongoing with one of our colleagues over at the USGS over in Lafayette. So, and I've had some students working on identifying all of the seeds. And again, the seeds that we see are very similar to what we would expect to see in the Southeast US. Other things we've done is pollen work. And this is work that Andy Reese has been doing over at Southern Mississippi. So what we see with the pollen, again, is very common assemblages to what we have in the Southeast US. We have bald cypress, we have pine, and we have tupelo. Now, as we go in and look at our sediment cores, we can see how things have changed through time by looking through the lens of our pollen and our seed records. So we're going to start at the bottom of this core, and that's where we have those rich organics. So looking at the bottom, those assemblages of pollen are very similar to what we see today in a modern swamp, our tupelo, the bald cypress. Now, as we go up core, so we're moving forward in time, we're going to see this shift. And you can almost imagine, I've got another graph up here. So here we're inland with our inland freshwater forest. So as we move up, that swamp assemblage is going to change to something that has more open forest and more grass. So you can imagine you're moving down towards the coast. So you're starting to see your forest change. Then we get into our third assemblage. This is a levee bar forest. This is a really unique assemblage that we found in the particular core we're looking at. And its modern analog is actually all the way up here in North Carolina. So you can almost imagine sea levels changing, but it's also getting colder because the assemblages we see are now, their modern equivalent is something that's a lot further north. So the last assemblage we have is grass. So this is telling you that the forest has gone away. We're now closer to the coast, and we're starting to get closer to marine environments. And above the grass, we have that erosional surface, and we move into our Holocene section of the core. So we can almost see how things are changing with time. So we started to put together a story of what we think happened and what happened looking at the paleogeography of the site through time. So the bottom, I've put back up our sea level curve. I put some markers on there. So the first one, this is what we think that landscape looked like when the forest was alive. You'll notice it's a good ways inland. It's also higher in elevation. So we're getting up to places close to like Hattiesburg would be an equivalent location today. So higher elevation, but you still have those swamps that exist. And you can see sea level, the coastline is way out here in the Gulf of Mexico. And you have the Mobile River Delta forming as well during this time. So during this interval A, sea level is dropping, and it's dropping. But we're going to get to an interval where sea level stops dropping, and it's going to increase, and it's going to increase very quickly. So one of the hypotheses we've been working on is this rapid pulse in sea level rise causes floodplain aggregation to occur. So you can imagine sea level comes up quickly, you start to get the floodplains moving inland, and you start to have more floods, and you start to have sediment dumping out over our bald cypress swamp. So then we move into the last glacial maximum. It's about 18,000 years ago. So the coastline has moved back out, so it's going to be at its maximum extent. So here the forest is no longer alive, it's buried, and it's buried under a lot of sediment. And because it's exposed on land, we're going to have some of that be eroded away. So then moving from last glacial maximum into the deglacial, you're going to have sea level increase, and we'll have that shift into the marine environment, and then eventually to the conditions we have today where it's open marine. And this tracks along with what we see in our sediment cores. So just to kind of wrap things up, I wanted to throw up some pictures of our team. Like I mentioned at the beginning of the talk, a lot of people have worked on this project. So some fun pictures from doing our field work. And I want to recognize our team members. So Grant Harley, Sam Bentley, Kevin Chu, Andy Reese, and Alicia Caparosa. Our wonderful students who've been involved in this project. It's been graduate students and undergrads. Jeff Suyapa, JT, Clay, Johnny, Caleb, Robin, Gil, Rodney, Brianne, Jeff, Huron, and Patrick. And then also our wonderful collaborators from other institutions, Zhongshan, Beth, River, Tom Gilderson, and have to talk about our boat captain and first mate, so Charlie and Chris. So we couldn't do our field work without them. So I'll want to say one more special thanks, and that's to the Coastal Studies Institute for supporting this project, also to the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management for funding our research, along with the Wallace Foundation, who gave us our original seed money to get the project started. And none of this would be possible without my dear friend and colleague, Ben Rains, who is a reporter over in Alabama, where I learned about the forest from him, and he's been wonderful to work with. He's made a documentary on the bald cypress site. It's on YouTube if you want to go in and take a look at it. What I just showed you is the latest results, so there's a little more background in this documentary. And hopefully we'll be able in the future to do a part 2 to that documentary as the project moves into phase 2 and we go out and do more work on the underwater forest.